Just a minute. I want to go live on YouTube first and mute it. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We've just started up about 5 minutes earlier to allow the early birds to get in, but we'll hold off for the next 4 minutes to let everybody else who's joining us this afternoon get to join us. Feel most welcome. You can start keying in your questions on the Q&A section. I see we already have quite a good turnout. We can take a moment to introduce ourselves on the chat section. From the registration, I can see a few of us who have been with us since we started this online trend in BDO back then. You've been with us through the forensic webinars and the following webinars that we've conducted. We'll eventually have all those sessions uploaded on our YouTube channel, and I'll share the link later after this webinar with all of you. Welcome very much. My name is Virginia Mwangi, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon. I'll hold off for the next 3 minutes, but you can introduce yourselves. We get to know whom we're interacting with on the chat section. Our chat section is open. Welcome, Margaret Matovo from Kohat Uganda Consultancy. Nice to have you this afternoon. The chat section, my apologies, it's now enabled. Let's get to know each other. Nahabo Edin from Bantwana, Uganda. You're very welcome this afternoon. Wherever you're joining us from, let us know. Fabrice from Rwanda, welcome. In case you already have queries in terms of internal audit, you can start keying in your questions in the Q&A section as we have our introductions on the chat section. Peter Ndichu from Kenya, Beatrice Omwanda from Kenya, karibu sana. We have Dennis Rukumo from Uganda Red Cross, you're welcome. Festus Mutulu from Kenya, Vas Colin from Kenya, Joseph from Rwanda, Maureen from Rwanda. Today seems we have quite a number from Rwanda, you're very much welcome. Abdurrahman from Somalia, you're very welcome. I think we got quite a few from Somalia also. Anthony from Kenya, Florence Kimel from Kenya, Kennedy from Kenya, Denise from Rwanda, Fred Othiambo from Pwani Oil, Kenya. You're very much welcome. It's now 2:30 p.m. As previously mentioned, my name is Virginia and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. You're welcome to the part 2 of the internal audits webinar series. There are 5 parts of it. And today we'll be addressing the agile audit methodologies in internal audit framework. We as BDO bear in mind that the business environment is really changing drastically. And it's about time we all pay attention to all the aspects of our businesses and identify the risk earlier before they interfere with how we run our businesses. Today, our panelists will be Zahir Sheikh. He's a familiar name to most of you. He's a partner risk advisory, internal audits and forensics in BDO in East Africa. We'll also have George, who is in internal audits and forensics as well. We'll have Neverland Moodley much later joining us. He is currently held up in a brief meeting, but we're hoping he'll manage to join us. If he doesn't, he will definitely be there for part 3, so do not miss out. I really hope you get to learn a lot this afternoon. Do not forget to key in your questions on the chat sections. We'll have all your questions addressed in the final session of this webinar. And without taking up much more time, let me let in Zahir Sheikh to take over. Zahir?
Thanks, Virginia, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Very excited to be here, as always. We've got people from many, many countries, and that is very exciting to see. The numbers are going up, which is great. We're expecting a good turnout, so hopefully more people will join. But let us start. So let me take you back to the first webinar, where we talked about the trends in internal audit. And this is one of the slides that I had. I said, internal auditors used to be like the 1960 car, but obviously now we need to transform, and many of us have transformed into that beautiful Lexus down there. 1960 cars, they didn't have self-drive, they couldn't park themselves. They didn't have all these intelligent computers on board. Everything was manual. You had to do all the work, and they were pretty difficult to drive. And today, if you gave somebody a 1960s car, other than maybe taking it for, somebody's wedding or something like that, the guy would refuse to drive it on a day-to-day basis. And that's the same thing with internal auditors. Things have evolved so much. The technology has changed around us. If we don't change ourselves, then we're going to find that we're being left behind. We talked about some of the trends that were forcing change in internal audit, such as privacy compliance, new cybersecurity regulations. Those require more audit involvement. At a board level, cybersecurity is becoming a key issue. Privacy compliance is becoming a key issue. So internal audit is involved there as well. Third-party risk management has become a key concern, and also digital business transformation. Integrated risk management also will remain key, and internal audit is using data analytics, process analytics more and more now as the data is increasing. So more skills required, more tools required for the internal auditor. We looked at the skills as well for future internal auditor. And here were some of the gaps that we identified: IT control frameworks, data analytics, security and privacy, agile auditing, which is what we're talking about today, fraud prevention, fraud control, fraud detection. All of those were identified as gaps. And risk management, by the way, still remains a gap. And then we looked at, what were the future jobs 2025, and what are some of the key skills. And you can see there, analytical thinking and innovation was going to be key. Active learning and learning strategies, complex problem solving, creativity, originality, and initiatives. We still have, in addition to this webinar, we still have 3 other parts. There's going to be the internal auditor in the digital age. That's coming next. And then we're going to go into risk management and evaluating the segregation of duties. And finally, on our part 5, we will have contract management and the internal auditor's role to yield savings and results. So the learning objectives for today is we are hoping that at the conclusion of this webinar, participants will be able to discuss how internal audit can respond quickly to changing business and emerging issues through increased engagement and through a collaborative approach. Also that internal audit can describe how to shift to a more risk-based audit plan, and internal audit can deliver impactful, relevant, and real-time insights as a result of continuous communication with all stakeholders. The key topics that we're going to discuss today is we're going to define agile software development and agile auditing. We're going to talk about the value proposition for agile auditing. We will look at the overview of the Scrum methodology and the execution of agile auditing process. And then we will look at some of the challenges, pitfalls, and some key lessons learned. And then we'll have a Scrum Up section where we're going to have some common questions asked and some of the answers that are provided to those questions. So what is agile auditing? Essentially, agile auditing is based on agile software development. This is something that started in the 1990s when people were developing software and they needed to have a methodology to ensure that their developers were following a strict project management methodology, and they came up with this framework. So there are 12 principles in the development of agile software. And this then became so popular that it started getting used not just in software development, but in project management and in all aspects of business where there are complicated projects, where there are complicated multitasks, cross-cultural teams. This became very, very popular. So it's also been applied very successfully to internal audit. The authors chose Agile as the label for this because it represented adaptiveness and it represented response to change, which was so important to their approach at the time. There are 12, like we said, key things in the manifesto, but here we're only going to talk about 4 of them. The 4 key values of the Agile Manifesto and what they could mean for internal audit. If you think about the first one, it's satisfy the customer through and continuous delivery, early and continuous delivery. What this means to me is it could lead to lower lead times and to real-time feedback. The second value is building a project around a team. Let's think about what this means. It's more interactive and more collaborative. We've tried this in practice, and when you build projects around teams, people feel included. And as a result, surveys have shown that teams which are included in projects early on, they feel part of it. Such teams have a 40% increase in productivity. So it's a wonderful way to actually work. The third value is working software as a primary measure of progress. And what this is talking about, the value, I mean, that's what this is talking about. Working software hopefully is valuable to someone. And therefore, working whatever you're delivering as a project, as a report, as change, it's got to have value to somebody. And once it's visible, once it's measurable, then obviously people appreciate this. And with this, internal audit is able to provide quick wins in the internal audit process that are visible and measurable. And the last value is welcome changing requirements. That to me means you're open to change and you actually want things to change. So how could this be relevant for us as internal auditors? This ties us going back to our first webinar, as being a dynamic profession, as being linked to key changes. We are really the sounding board for board of directors, for the owners of the company, and we act as their ears and their eyes. And therefore, we need to be abreast of all the changes, and we need to be skilling up. And this framework that we're talking about today is meant to do exactly that. It's meant to enable us to work across cross-cultural teams and across various activities in a very refined and defined manner. So we talked about how internal audit should be a dynamic profession. We've talked about the fact that internal audit, as we know, it's the value add perception has been going down. If you look at surveys over many, many years now, internal audit is seen to be adding less value on an year-to-year basis, because internal auditors are still tied down to the very old way of doing work, policies, procedures, going through a manual, and it's got to be that way. Whereas the needs, the real business needs and the risks have changed, businesses have moved on, and we seem to sometimes actually be seen as people who hold things back. We are not seen as enablers, we're actually seen as people who block. So this is one way of changing things, and it provides an alternative approach to the traditional way, firstly by changing the mindset. So it's not just changing the mindset of internal audit, but it's actually changing the mindset of all the stakeholders, whether it's your internal clients, whether it's the board of directors, everybody that we serve. It's changing the mindset throughout by introducing this methodology as an alternative to the traditional methodology. So if you look at this circle here, and how we can bring to life the agile auditing value proposition, I'm going to contrast it with the traditional internal audit approach. Let's look at the diagram from the Institute of Internal Auditors, which we have borrowed here. The diagram is like a wheel or a circle, excuse me. So it's like a wheel or circle which is continuous. It's without a beginning or without an end. So if you contrast that to the traditional approach of auditing, which is more of a waterfall or a linear approach where you plan, you test, and then you report, this doesn't really tie in or relate to each other, and there's no circle there. So if you take one thing away from this webinar, that's really the mindset. It's the focus on what is most important to the users of the audit, and we do that first. What does that really mean? That means that you're focusing on your stakeholder, which is a little bit different from what traditional approach has been. I'm now going to summarize some of the key differences. So when it comes to planning, agile approach, it stresses stakeholder involvement. In the traditional approach, planning is done in a vacuum or nearly in a vacuum. Sometimes it's called negotiating. So you negotiate your plan for the year. In agile audit, planning allows us to adapt to change. In traditional internal audit, the reports are bulky. If you've seen some of our reports, the bosses used to say, just drop it on the table. And if the whole table shakes because of the weight, the report has passed the weight test. But obviously things have changed now. Those reports, they would come at the end of a very long audit cycle. And sometimes by the time they were coming, they were too late and things might have moved on. In agile audit, it's actually the opposite, because it's less documentation and it's more focused on insights. The other big difference here is in the approach, where agile stresses creativity. Here, the stakeholders are involved in the process right from the beginning. They probably value things differently versus the traditional approach, where the emphasis is on policies and procedures. We tend to go there because that is like our comfort zone. Let's look at some of the benefits or the value that the agile approach can bring to internal audit. If you choose to implement this framework, These are some of the benefits that you will find. The framework is flexible and responsive. It's got a proven track record of success. It's been around since the early 2000s. It's customizable, which we'll talk about a little later. It's not one size fits all. You are driven to focus on efforts to delivering business value, and that's because you're focused on what matters most to stakeholders. It also has increased involvement of the stakeholders, and you are aligned to them, or you have a common vision. Therefore, you're going to have higher team engagement. That's because the process itself is going to be more interactive, which itself is going to increase your own enjoyment and a better relationship with the people that you're working on. It also stresses creativity. And one of the big pluses here is less documentation. That's one of the things that I've disliked most in my time in audit. It's the extensive documentation. It's sticking to the very hard and fast old rules, policies, procedures, and manuals. And we are actually moving away from that now. It also increases team productivity. I talked about the 40% increase in productivity when you're part of a team that is driven to achieve quick wins and quickly move on to the next project with better insights and a more refined approach. Also, you're going to spend less time in the field. And then finally, you're going to have the ability to manage changing priorities and identify roadblocks much sooner. That's because we will have lower lead times and we will have real-time feedback. Now let's look at the overview of the Scrum methodology and execution. So as we've just learned, Agile auditing was developed as an alternative to the traditional audit approach. So to appreciate Agile, let's talk a little bit about what is non-Agile. And since it's often contrasted with the traditional waterfall method or model, we want to first describe what that is and then talk about why we need a different approach. Traditional audit follows the normal method, which is basically you have planning, you have risk assessment, you then have field work followed by review, and then you report your findings to management. The problem with this approach is that your audit objectives are locked down in the initial stages. Then there is very little flexibility to change them once you're deep into your fieldwork. But things evolve continuously and you're expected to adapt quickly. So if you have to wait for months to get the final report, it probably won't be very relevant at that point. Also, traditionally, the process owners are consulted right at the beginning of the project and not so much at the later phases until the report is delivered. So there are chances that they may not be on the same page as you and may not agree with your findings. Agile, on the other hand, is designed to overcome some of these challenges. So rather than completing the audit phases one at a time, Agile recognizes that changes are a part of the deal. So what it does, it actually takes the theme project and the audit objectives and it breaks it down in the order of priority and it puts this into the audit backlog. And by doing this, it actually focuses on delivering the insights from your stakeholders and your own findings. You go for each sprint to the audit client at a very early stage of the process. So the problem that we spoke about, timeliness, is eliminated by design here, because now this provides value throughout the project. It also encourages close collaboration with the business because the teams work together as the project progresses and the deliverables are phased not at the end, but throughout the audit. This also avoids any disagreements, which often result from traditional approach as a result of working in silos. In Agile, the observations, the findings, and the recommendations are typically discovered together when you meet when the audit team meets with its internal clients. So, as a good way to sum up, the agile way of working, it's that it's quite social, it's quite enjoyable. There's a lot of interaction, there's a lot of collaboration. And as part of the design, it would be very difficult for the team to work in silos in an agile engagement. Agile is based on the principles of the Scrum framework. And the reason we are using Scrum is because it's lightweight, it lends itself well to auditing, and it was also voted many, many times as the most popular framework for managing projects, such as the ones we have in internal audit. So Scrum is lightweight, yet it's incredibly powerful. It has a powerful set of values, principles, and practices upon which it is based. Scrum relies on cross-functional teams to deliver products and services in short cycles, enabling fast feedback. It enables continuous improvement. It enables rapid adaptation to change and also accelerated delivery. So let's look at some of the principles that Scrum uses, beginning with the empirical process control. This emphasizes the core philosophy of Scrum, which is based on the three main ideas of transparency, inspection, and adaptation. These three values or virtues in Scrum are called the three pillars of empiricism. And what is empiricism? Empiricism basically is working in a fact-based, evidence-based, and experience-based manner. So everything that we're doing in agile auditing is actually based on facts, it's based on evidence, it's based on experience, and that's why you have the reiterative process where you're just learning and you're improving. What this basically means is that decisions are made based on observation and experimentation rather than defining them upfront. The second principle is self-organization, which focuses on the project work, and teams basically have to deliver greater value. So they are encouraged to self-organize rather than the old school, which is basically the command and control principle. The third principle is collaboration, and this advocates project management as a shared value and as a value creation process. So with teams working and interacting together and relying on each other to get the project or the work done. The next principle, the fourth principle, is value-based prioritization. This highlights business value early in the project, and it is looked at on a continuous basis. So at all particular times, you're looking at activities that bring value. You're not looking at just policies and procedures and controls and safeguards for the sake of it, but you're looking at what gives real value to the business. The next one is time boxing. This emphasizes time as a limiting constraint, and it helps to manage product planning and execution. The time box elements and in Scrum includes sprints, daily stand-up meetings, and so on. And finally, we have iterative development. This emphasizes how to better manage and build projects that satisfy customer needs, because you can incorporate your learning from one stage onto the next. To summarize, Scrum is a framework, and though you're free to customize it, it's important to keep the principles intact so that you can attain the objectives of the project. Moving on to the actual execution of an agile audit, I want to emphasize here that agile auditing is not a one-size-fits-all and diverse. It only equips you with a framework that you can adopt and you can change. It's like your organization fabric rather than a specific fitting methodology. So think in terms think about Agile in terms of something with a beginning, with a middle, and an end. Starting at the left of the diagram, I'll just define some of the terms there. Audit universe, we're probably aware, this is the document that details all of the audit activities which are carried out by the internal audit function. And then you've got your tasks and backlog, which is all of the things that you need to do in your audit plan, which have to be addressed in the year. But in Agile auditing, the backlog is dynamic because it's constantly being updated based on value to the stakeholder. And it's never considered complete. It's just constantly evolving. And it is based on your risk-based audit plan to a large extent. So look at the beginning. The beginning is all about, you can look at it almost like a treasure hunt. You're seeking out what value we can achieve from this project. How does it align with the strategy of the business and with the risks associated with that particular process? It's a collaborative exercise where the internal audit team and the audit client, which is your internal stakeholders, they meet together, they define the initial project plan, and there's a very high level exercise that the team goes through. So from the very beginning, internal audit is talking to all of the stakeholders in even coming up with the audit plan and with the backlog. So if you've got to take an example, say for an inventory audit, the objective here can be to assess whether inventory is reflected in the balance sheet and whether it physically exists and includes all material owned by the client. The scope here would include maybe reconciliations, valuations, cut-off procedures, some data analytics. The difference here is that this will be ordered based on their value to the business. Now we can move on to the middle portion. The middle portion is the actual sprint. It's the work that you picked up to do the field work. It's your scoping, it's your tasks that you've decided for that particular sprint. This is where your sprint is driving your efforts of iterated planning, testing, field work, and also the reporting phases of that task. At this stage, you will get into the detailed work plan. You're in constant touch with your audit client. You have daily stand-up meetings to talk about your progress. You share your insights at the end of the sprint. And it's an iterative process. And you have as many sprints as you need to fulfill your objective. The beauty of this method is that, say after 2 sprints with inventory management, you may decide that your major objective is achieved, or you may decide that there was a change that has now come to the attention of yourself and even your stakeholders, and now you can revise your backlog, you can revise your plan, and you can conduct a different sprint. So the backlog is a living document which is constantly updated. And the end phase is a wrap-up where you present your final report, including all your observations and the managed responses. And you conduct a retrospective meeting with your team to debrief on what went well and the key lessons learned. So I know this is a very high-level overview, but let's look at what an agile sprint looks like in practice. Here, I've just contrasted the agile audit process, and I've shown you what the traditional approach looks like compared with the agile audit. So if you look at this, you can see the agile audit principles and how those are applied to internal audit methodology. The chart depicts 6 things. There are the user stories, and these stories are basically comprise the audit program, which contains all of the tests, and they will be ordered by priority. This is the full list of audit tests which are needed to complete the audit. Then you've got to have the product backlog, and you can think of the product backlog as the collection of all your audit tests that have yet to be completed. So this is basically, what's still pending. Then you've got the sprint planning meeting, where the process owner, the scrum master, and the team estimate the work to complete each audit test, which is now the user story. As it's defined in Scrum, they call it the user story, but we'll call it the audit test, and determine which ones will be included in each session. And that's traditionally the audit project plan. And then you've got the sprint backlog. This is the sprint retrospective. It considers what went well, what could have been done differently, and it gives kudos to team members who have done well, so that the next sprint can be improved and it can be even better. And then you've actually got the Scrum itself, okay, which is now the continuous process where you've got planning, refinement, you've got field work, you've got supervisory review, you've got improvements in the product that you're delivering, and then you've got the sprint retrospective. And your Scrum will involve daily or periodic stand-up meetings with a focus on removing blockers and so on. And then finally, you have the final product, which is your final audit report. So now if we go back to the inventory example that we had, and just to contrast the traditional approach with using agile auditing, let's take one example of, say, for example, you're doing a audit and you are looking at inventory in 12 plants. So in the traditional approach, you would say, well, we've got 12 plants. We're going to only visit 4 plants this year, and we'll take a look at our inventory. So we'll deal with the other plants over 3 years. We'll hit the other 8 plants over the next 2 years. Typically, when you go to the plant, it won't just be inventory that you're looking at. You're also going to be looking at other things. You might look at procurement. You might look at HR, but it's going to be based on an audit program that you have created. And then it just keeps getting rolled out and refreshed every year. But with agile audit, the focus is on stakeholder involvement, and the focus is on metrics and on triggers, measurable things that didn't go right in the organization, and things that were triggers. So your system has actually said something is not right in inventory. So for example, in our example, if you say out of the 12 plants, 2 plants had shown some sort of metrics. The KPIs were in the red, and let's say that one of the metrics was about shrinkage in inventory. So if you had certain shrinkage percentages, maybe you had a couple of columns on in your program, that would trigger an audit. So how would you approach this using the agile methodology? So what you do is, prior to the field work, you would meet up with the stakeholders after those KPIs have been triggered, and you discuss this with them, and you would come up with a plan of what, why do you think this has happened. So you're actually consulting them. You're trying to find out the reasons why this might have happened. And what you'll find is that the stakeholders might already know. Usually they in fact know what's going on, and they have a good idea. So what we do is we kind of hypothesize with them, and we say, all right, here are the causes, and perhaps we take 1 or 2 causes for each plant, and then we go and we take a look at those over a shorter time frame, maybe over 1 or 2 weeks. We go out there and we have a look, and then we come back with the results at the end. So to do this, the team composition is going to be quite different from your traditional audit. You're going to want to make sure that you can execute in that 1 or 2 week, whatever your stakeholder has come up with. You'll need a much more diverse team. You're probably going to need somebody who has plant experience, because now you're going there, you actually want to identify the problem. You're not taking 8 weeks to do all 12 or maybe even your 4. Like in the traditional audit, you've only given yourself 1 or 2 weeks. So you need people who can hold your hand and quickly identify some of the issues. So you might actually go there with your plant manager. You may go there with somebody maybe from cost accounting. somebody who understands valuations, if that's what you're going to look at. And you might even take the inventory accountant, and then maybe you'll take somebody from finance as well. So in this case, the report is going to be much smaller. It's not going to be a 8-week long report. It's going to be a much shorter report because you've only spent 1 or 2 weeks. But look at the value that this could bring to your stakeholder. It's likely to be much higher because this is something that you agreed upon. So here's a practical example of how this can be applied. Let's now look at some of the Scrum attributes. So here on this slide, we're looking at some of the elements that will help define what Scrum is. And the first aspect that we're going to talk about here is the Scrum workflow. So here we use time boxes and we use sprints. A time box just means that there is a definitive start and end date, and this doesn't change. This is where the work gets done, and it's a consistent duration of typically 1 to 2 weeks. So if you've got lots of similar activities, you now have put this down into 1 or 2 weeks, and you're getting your team to try and stick to those deadlines. Typically, you will plan for the sprint to be executed, and you'll share your observations or insights at the end of the sprint. Then you will have a sprint retrospective for the lessons learned that can be applied to future sprints. And the two elements that help drive what is accomplished here are your cadence and your matrix. So your Scrum cadence is quite an important aspect of Scrum. The audit backlog, it serves as a planning document. It defines the scope and all of the tasks that need to be done. Daily stand-up meetings that accomplish the specific goals and so on and so forth. In fact, you're actually going to be standing up during those meetings and you talk about what is accomplished, what you will do for the day, etc., and any impediments that may need intervention from the Scrum manager. There's a detailed work plan specifically for that sprint. It's like a roadmap for the delivery of insights for that particular activity or that particular sprint. And then the sprint review is a simple check for the team to deliberate whether the sprint goals have been met and marked as done. The sprint retrospective at the end of the project, it captures what went well and what didn't. A good way to conduct this meeting is by asking the team members to share what they should start, stop, and continue doing based on their sprint experience. So you actually identify the next couple of sprints based on what's worked, where have you had some success, and okay, can we do something better? Can we even provide more value in similar areas where there may be issues? So this then brings us to the Scrum metrics. And because a lot of the teams are self-organizing, there's a need to understand how they're doing. And this is exactly why you need your metrics, because this is what provides the feedback from your loop. And we'll talk a little bit about it on the next slide. So let's see, maybe the slide after this actually. So here, let's look at Scrum roles. The Agile team is made up of a core team, and then the stakeholders and the project sponsors. So the stakeholders and project sponsors, they obviously have a very important role because they are the reason that the project is being sponsored. I mean, they're the ones who are driving your backlog. They're the ones who are actually driving your audit plan because it's based on business needs. It's based on triggers in the business, things that haven't gone right, things that need to be improved, where internal audit can be involved. And your core team is involved with the day-to-day running of the project iterations, and it consists of the project, the audit product owner, and the audit Scrum master, and then the Scrum team members. So the audit product owner is the person who is going to lead the project to success. It's typically your audit director who understands the vision of the project, and he works with stakeholders to represent the interest of the team. And he's ultimately held accountable for the team's results. The Scrum team is usually the people who get the work done on your day-to-day basis. They are the audit staff members designated for that project. So they will do the field work, and they are involved in regular team activities like the daily stand-up meetings. They will have a team room. Sometimes it's called a war zone because that's where all the battles happen. They will also have Microsoft Teams. They will have tools like Microsoft Teams, Jira, Trello, or anything that allows online collaboration. Or you might have your physical combos where you've got some people working on the clients, on the premises, some people working from home, but they're still attending via Jira and via Trello. For those of you who don't know Jira or Trello, Jira is basically an issues and project tracking software. It helps teams plan, assign, track, and report, manage their work, and it brings teams together from, for agile kind of projects. And then Trello is basically similar. It's a web-based project management tool. You can set up a board in seconds. You can automate tedious tasks, and you can collaborate with anyone, anywhere, even on a mobile. And lastly, let's look at the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master, his role is typically played by the audit manager. He may be supervising multiple audit engagements on projects, but essentially he acts as the team facilitator. So he organizes and brings the teams together. And most importantly, he manages the relationship between the stakeholders or your project sponsors and the Scrum team. So it's his job to remove any blocks, any impediments, or escalate wherever necessary, because basically he's the one who ensures high performance in the team. So you can see here within the team circle, everybody is going to be totally committed to the success of the project because everybody's got something, everybody's got their fingers in the pie, as you would say. That brings us to the transparency, because Scrum relies on transparency, and the Scrum Master must work with the product owner, the team, and everybody else involved to understand if the projects are complete and that they're completely transparent. And by that, we mean that your backlog items need to be clear, visible, and testable. So the definition of done, or the DOD, and the definition of ready are important. And sometimes these are misunderstood concepts in Scrum. So let me just clarify what these are. The definition of done, it's usually a short document in the form of a checklist, and this will define when a product backlog item, for example, your user story or your project, is considered done. Now, what does done mean? Done in Agile means no more work needs to be done before shipping. So look at it, you're actually ready to ship this particular product away from internal audit. So if someone says the feature is done, but it only needs to be integrated, it only needs to be tested, it only needs to be deployed, it would not be considered to be done, not in an Agile sense. Finally, let's look at metrics under the internal audit Scrum methodology. So metrics are a crucial part of the process, which obviously helps the teams to monitor their progress towards the goal. And there is loads of metrics out there, and each project is expected to pick the ones which makes sense for them. So depending on your project, you can always find a metric to measure whatever it is that you want to measure. But the important point that I want to drive home here is you're measuring the right thing, because your measurement must serve a purpose. You don't want to measure something that you don't plan to act on. So I've listed some popular metrics here, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about one, which is the Scrum board. And also because these days, that's the most widely used. The Scrum board is a tool which helps teams to make a visual representation of all of the things they need to do, like all of the items on your sprint backlog. So you can basically have this on a physical form, or you can have it on a virtual form, but essentially it's going to perform the same function of regardless of how it looks. So if you're using a physical board like the one that I'm showing here, you can see that it has three main columns. These are the to-do column, the doing column, and the done column. So you gather around with the team for your daily stand-up meeting, typically just for about 15 minutes, and then the team describes their accomplishments and their obstacles here to you as the audit or Scrum manager. So you pick up your post-it notes with your tasks from the to-do column, and let's say you had task 1 as obtain cutoff information from the client, and task 2 as complete the analytical procedures for inventory for say plant B. Now let's say you've completed task 2, which means it goes to the done column. But your client is away and you couldn't complete task 1. What was task 1? Obtain cutoff information from the client. So you have, however, sent your client an email with your request for the cutoff information. So what you can do is you move this to the doing column, and then you pick up your tasks for the day and you put them in the to-do column. Basically, during this meeting, every team member has to answer 3 questions. What have you done since your last, since our last meeting? What are you planning to do between now and your next term? And are there any problems or impediments that are preventing you from achieving your goals? Those are the 3 questions. Okay, what have you done since I last saw you? What are you going to do between now and the next time we meet? And do you have any impediments that are stopping you from achieving your goal? I really like this because it allows the team to talk about how they're going to do, how they're doing things, what they've done, and how all of this ties to the grand overall scheme of whatever audits you are doing. And with this, you can track your backlog readiness with what is done, what is needed to be done, and what is still going to be done, what is being done in your sprints, in your daily sprints. So it's simple and it's effective, and it basically holds yourself and your entire team accountable throughout. So I'm going to now hand over to my colleague George to take you through the rest of the presentation. Thanks. Over to you, George.
Thanks, Zahir. So taking over from where Zahir has got us up to, I'll want us to reflect a little bit on you as an internal auditor or as a chief audit executive, what you've been and what is the expectation of the next generation internal auditor. And is a key emphasis to this webinar series, what is the internal audit of the future looking like? And there are issues within the profession and internal audit environment that are influencing what it is that we're doing and have driven us as a firm to take up this initiative to do this series. We mentioned last time that there's a lot of changes in technology that is affecting us as a profession, the methodologies that we're looking at, and the pressures from those charged with governance, who it is that we report to. So one of the questions as we consider the value proposition of you as an internal auditor, which ran through the webinar advert that we ran, which is assurance, insight, and objectivity. One of the things that you need to understand is, as an internal auditor, as a chief audit executive, who are your stakeholders? Who are your customers? And who are the process owners? And I like as many of us as can be able to respond to that question without running the poll, to just type on the chat section, who are your stakeholders? When you're doing your job, who are your customer and who is your client? And who is the process owner in that exercise? Let's quickly respond to that as we take a break from the theory part to the practical session of this agile auditing. Let's see who is responding on this in the question and answer section of the chat section. Who are your stakeholders? Who are your customers? Who is the process owner of what you actually do within your organization? The executive management are the stakeholders, employees, public, shareholders, consumers. Because with that understanding, we'll be able to understand why is it that as a firm we're emphasizing on this agile approach to internal audit. Because there is a value element that agile auditing will bring to us as we undertake our audit exercise. Now, the customer gets more informed with agile auditing. That has been emphasized in Zahir's presentation. There is a provision of feedback, real-time feedback, when you're dealing with that customer. Now, you react and modify your audit plan on a continuous basis to ensure that you incorporate what it is that they need or consider to be necessary. The agile principles, as has been mentioned, reacts quickly and easily. It's quite adaptable, and it's usually driven by the stakeholders' insights. Traditionally, we used to do an audit plan, an annual audit plan, and we stick to that audit plan throughout the year. You can imagine looking at an example of human resource at the first quarter of the year. And if you're using a 3-year quarter cycle, 3-year audit plan, maybe that section would be looked at in the following year. Now, what would happen is, if there are issues that were picked during your first quarter, unless you're doing a follow-up to the same, you'll probably look at it in the following year. Now, agile auditing, much as it's not reinventing the wheel, proposes a different methodology where you're continuously looking at some of the issues that face you on a daily basis during your scrums, so that you address the issues on a continuous basis. Now, Zahir has mentioned about a board, and the board comes from a Japanese term called Kanban, and that visual signal, which would look at something like this, you'd have it in the audit or the chief executive's office, where you're looking at your audit backlog, your sprint backlog, how you're executing the job, and considering your DORs on a continuous basis. And you'll actually be moving everything that is in your backlog to execution and clearing it on a regular basis, which could be on a weekly basis, or during your meeting with the updates of what is happening, what are the challenges that you're having. You'll be moving it between these sections on a daily basis. So we won't stick to the old traditional plan that we used to have previously, which lies in our machine, but we'll try to be as practical as possible and have a board in your office that is actually considering every item that is being considered within our sprints, to ensure that how we are looking at audit exercise is quite flexible and not rigid as we used to do our exercises. One of the other things that has been mentioned is there's a regular update of this board to ensure that you are responding to any changes that are happening following clients' feedback. We have mentioned in our chat who are our clients, and immediately you obtain a feedback from your client and your stakeholders, you update it on this board. And in your sprint sessions, you ask yourself, what is it that needs to change in your audit approach? Agile audit approach is people-driven, and you won't stick to the old traditional method where you'd look at a straight line of your audit plan from the beginning to the end without involving the client. Imagine a situation of like the two examples that we've given, HR and inventory. You start off an audit exercise, you run with it till the end, and it's at the tail end when you actually give the process owner or your client the reports. That's when they are actually responding to what it is that you picked up. Agile proposes a different approach to this, where you involve them in the exercise so that on a continuous basis, you are responding to whatever changes that are happening. In our last series, we asked ourselves, how many of us as chief audit executive changed our audit plan following COVID-19 pandemic? Or did we stick to the old traditional audit plan, even with the changes in our work environment, working from home, remote working conditions? How many of us managed to change our audit plan? Agile audit approach would have worked quite well in such a scenario, because you would easily pull up your team together, get them together for a meeting, involve the stakeholders, and run quick meetings that resort to quick results and move on to the next sprint area or issue or backlog that is on your Kanban board. Now, one of the things and another principle that I'll bring in at this point is Moscow, and I'll request us to take note of this. Moscow emphasizes on must have, should have, could have, or will not have. If you're to ask yourself as an audit executive, what is it that I must have, I should have, could have, will not have? It will direct you to quickly be checking out on whatever it is that you're doing on a regular basis to ensure that you are adaptive to and responding to the changes that are required by your clients. That way, you don't stick to the traditional plan where you're running everything from beginning to end without involving the stakeholders. Now, one of the other things we'd want to consider at this stage is, what are the challenges to agile audit? Now, while we are not proposing a new way of doing things within the internal audit framework, you still have to execute, you still have to plan, execute, report within the internal audit framework. But because, as mentioned earlier, we have to have a different mindset, one of the critical things that needs to happen within the team is that changed mindset. Agile internal audit proposes a different mindset where you can continually get even involved and collaborate with the stakeholders while still maintaining the objectivity and give the audit committee the assurance and insight required from the processes that you're reviewing. So if your team do not possess the necessary skill set, you'll have challenges adapting to the new approach of Agile, which we are proposing today. Now, one of the other things that is critical to this is that it requires a top-down approach. You, as a chief audit executive, you'll have to manage your team such that they are reporting to you on a continuous basis. They are giving you feedback. you're giving them advice on how they need to handle the various process reviews that needs to happen. And if the right advisory is not being given from the top, the process is likely to fail. That mind shift, even at the top, requires transformed leadership behavior. You can imagine yourself in a scenario where you used to sending your team out for a period of 8 to 12 weeks, then they come back and report to you. Changing that to a 1 week or 2 week sessions, or even a daily scrum, you need to provide leadership, and that is required for each of the chief of executive that has a team that they're dealing with. Remember also the collaborative approach towards agile auditing requires also you involve a few other people, or rather the process owners in this process, so that they give you feedback on what needs to change. For example, at the moment, most of organizations have adopted IT as a technology. And as we emphasized in our last audit, IA webinar series, you as an internal audit executive also needs to adapt to that. If you're not IT savvy, you'll find yourself lagging, and all the process owners giving you information that you cannot be able to deal with. Now, agile approach is not proposing that you drop IA principles. So the framework under which we operate needs to still be adhered to, and it's critical, so that at each cycle, much as you'd have wanted to only report to the audit committee on one issue, because it's the only issue that you ran with within an 8-12 week cycle, you'll be reporting to them on 6-7 areas that you have looked at within that period by adopting agile approach. Now, there are challenges that would come depending on how the organizational culture is and how units and branches are distributed. The teams that you're working with, maybe your one-man department, so that you cannot be able to run with this agile auditing. So it would be a challenge for you to run with it. Now, the question is, as a chief audit executive, if you're given a new challenge that needs to be resolved because you're supposed to be adding value to an organization, say from IT, how will you be able to ensure that that feedback gets to management, it's handled well, you provide feedback to the process owner, and you resolve and add value to that unit? Now, if the commitment by top management is not there, your leadership is lacking in that area, and you're not able to turn around any feedback that you're getting from the process owners, you'll find that this approach of agile, which you're proposing, will be lacking or not effective in your organization. Now, it requires a lot of coaching from the top, and the chief audit executive needs to coach his team to be able to adapt to this approach. You'll struggle also if you're dealing in an environment and someone proposed that your consumers would be regulators, your reports will need to go to the regulators. How is it that your reporting framework would adapt to this agile approach to auditing? So in a summary, those are the things that would give be a struggle to you if you're adopting this style. And the question is then, how then do we scrum it up? How do we escalate? How do we change as an internal audit department or profession to ensure that we adapt ourselves as a profession to this framework and also with the changing trends that are happening. So we've got to reflect, and this came from our previous webinar, a lot of coaching. There's scaling that needs to happen, and you need to consider the weaknesses within your team to see how best do I change from the current way of doing things to adopt to the new norm. So considering that that work, how is it that I'll move from the current level to the next level in agile auditing? You may want to consider having a small team and doing a pilot project to see how is it that agile can work to me, to my department, and to my organization. You may want to put together and look at a department in isolation, pick up all the issues that you're supposed to address within an 8-12 cycle, and look at it whether we can be able to break it into 1-2 weeks and run it with it using an agile audit approach. If the pilot can work, you can actually escalate the same to the whole organization. The next thing would be you allow the management to buy in to the new audit approach, the agile audit approach, which you'd actually go to the committee and propose, this is what we intend to be doing moving forward. And you'll come up with the proposition and put across to the audit committee that this is the value proposition you get from agile audit approach as opposed to the traditional method of doing audit. Taking it further, you'll need to consider how can I get some training, either for myself and for my team, on agile auditing. It will be critical for your team to change their mindset from what they used to do audit before to an agile way, as proposed in our previous slides. There are a few changes to what we used to traditionally do audit, to the Scrum methodology, the sprint sessions, and you'll need some coaching to your team and to yourself to be able to adopt the new style. A few customization will need to happen within the organization and within your department as you adopt agile auditing, so that you match the expectations of the organization and your way of doing audit. How that will happen, it will take, and it happens with many organizations, you'll have different departments, different units. Previously, you just used to audit IT as a whole, but you may want this time to break and fragment the various functions within IT and have sprint sessions on specific functions so that you quickly execute, close on each of those sessions away from what you used to do, look at a whole department as a whole. So that customization will be critical to you as a function within the organization. Now, right size for each sprint based on the sprint goals. Again, as I said, you will need to help your team to adapt to this new method of audit or approach, because depending on the department you're looking at, and if you expect quick feedback within 1-2 weeks, you may have to balance the teams as you're allocating them to the different sprints that you'll create from your Kanban. Now, you'll be challenging the normal way of doing things. So as an internal audit department, you'll need to up your game on your standard processes to be able to quickly report and close the loop so that each of the sprint sessions that you have deliver value to the organization. The collaboration that you're mentioning and as proposed by Agile approach considers involvement and collaboration with the teams, even the process owners. It's the only way you'll be able to improve and add value as an internal audit function to the entire organization as a whole. So when you considering, for example, policy issues, strategic decisions, how do I get my seat on the table with management and with those charged with governance, introduce my proposition and what value I'd want to add to that, to the management or to the board, but still ensure that I'm still independent and objective, and I still can come back and review whatever it is that they have decided. So the collaboration for continuous improvement, both internally and externally, has to be done in such a way that you are considering those standards all along the way. Now, the plan to change as a department, as a function, means that you're challenging the status quo. And you can't afford to just sit back and see things change and hope that as an internal audit function, you still have a seat at the table. So it will be good for you to also plan to change, and that's why we are proposing this agile approach to auditing, because it's the only way you'll be able to add value to the organization and to those whom you're reporting to. When we consider the value proposition as proposed within the internal audit framework, you're supposed to provide insight on the various processes within an organization or your organization. Now, you can't just sit back and watch things happen. And that is why we need to adapt as a department to ensure that we add value and provide insight. I'll end it at that point and welcome questions, concerns, feedback, and the team within us will respond to any concerns that will be raised, and pass it on to Virginia to moderate the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zahir and George, for that wonderful presentation. Lots of insight on Agile internal audit. We'll go through just a few questions because we're past time. We're supposed to have finished at 3:30, but thank you for staying with us. We have Miyogishima requesting George to define how Agile approach defines audit backlogs.
So basically, the audit backlog, as in Agile, is your key priorities as identified in consultation with your stakeholders. It's not your traditional plan, as in your traditional approach, which was based on maybe a 5-year plan, and then you break it down into 1 year, or 2 year, or 3 years running. We gave an example from inventory. It's actually based, it's a living document. It's based on continuous consultation and collaboration with all the key stakeholders. So you're not just looking at finances, you're working with the board, you're going to be working on areas of data privacy, you're going to be working on areas of cybersecurity, all of these, anything that requires a third set of eyes. You remember, we're the third lines of defense. So anything that requires that third set of eyes in the organization, then obviously you need to be involved. And the greater the value to the organization, the higher up it needs to be in your audit backlog. So that's how audit backlog is defined in Agile.
All right, thank you, Zahir. In case there's a follow-up question on that, don't hesitate to leave your question on the Q&A section. We'll get right back to you. We'll end it at this point. We'll send out the presentation and the certificate to this webinar. If you need to recap on a few things that were presented here, all this is available on our YouTube channel, that is BDO in East Africa. We hope to see you on 15th of September for our third episode. And the third episode is all about how we're enhancing internal audit using technology. It's going to be exciting, and we'll leave you for now. I can see we still have more questions coming in. We'll get back to you through your emails. Also ensure you update the name that you logged into the webinar with, because that is the name that is going to appear on your certificate. The certificates are auto-generated. So yes, keep posting your questions or Q&A. We'll end this session, but we will leave the Q&A open. Keep posting them and we'll reach out back to you much later. Someone is requesting for the YouTube channel, and it's posted here. I've just posted it here in the chat section. There you go. In case you encounter difficulties getting it, reach out to me, Virginia, through our communications email. So we'll end it at this point. See you on 15th of September. Have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye.
Goodbye, folks.